What is up, and welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Practical Planner Podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Goldman, here with me and Rhodes, and we have Christopher Holtby here today as well. So, Christopher basically works at a trust company, and I think this is a really important conversation for us to have because, prior we've talked about trustees, the value of trustees, but we haven't talked about corporate trustees versus individual trustees, why we hire them out, et cetera. So, Christopher, thanks for joining us today, man.
Right.
Maybe before we dive into it, you want to kind of just give a quick intro of who you are, what you do, and then we'll go from there.
So we're a trust company where clients can keep their financial advisor. We're based in South Dakota. We're ex Ernst and Young guys, and we just do the boring work and we never touch the investments. That's it.
Hmm, okay, simple enough. That keeps it simple enough. Well, let's talk. Let's just kind of start the conversation around like what, why do people hire trustees? Like, what is the value in it? Because I think for a lot of advisors, they hear clients complain about the cost of having a trustee, and so they're like, ah, like how do we get them out of the mix?
So a trustee, whether it's an individual or corporate trustee, can only do four things: manage money, distribute money, tax returns, and other administrative issues. Most advisors would like to work with a corporate trustee that only does three: distributions, taxes, and the other administrative duties. But the real focus that a trustee does is they're involved in the risk and time of following the rules that one of an advisor's clients created with the attorney. So it's all about who gets the money, when, why, where, and how. And that's called a discretionary discussion. And so it's really a mixture of the corporate trustee reading the trust document, making a discretionary decision, working with the advisor. So it's done in a collaborative way. So the beneficiary or the client's advisor sees sort of one thought leader without it being confusing and, like a plate of spaghetti. So again, corporate trustees do four. Advisors want to use a corporate trustee that only does three, and that's never manage money.
Understandable. So when does the conversation start for an advisor or for anybody thinking to hire somebody versus use somebody they know?
So what we've seen over the last sort of 20 years is it's based upon either a blended family, uh, children who could blow the money, sort of think sudden wealth, or it could come from they don't have anyone that they know and trust, or most importantly, the dollar amounts get bigger. So think of 2 to 3 million. You see a lot of friends and family named in that position. Anne has seen this. Sort of 2 to 10 is that gray zone where now you're deciding, do I want my cousin who I love, but they don't even manage their own money, let alone know how taxes work in the legal world. And once you get over 10 million, that's when you see corporate trustees being used more and more often. And
And that
again, yeah, sorry.
oh, and I was gonna say that line actually makes a lot of sense, Christopher, because historically, and this is probably before the OBBBA, rose or made the federal exemption, up to 15 million and now adjusted for inflation starting next year, that $10 million line is really where you start thinking taxes as well and estate taxes. And so all of a sudden, you may need for that specific tax planning strategy for why that trust even exists, you may need an independent trustee, somebody who's not too closely related to the person who formed the trust. So there are special rules about that. That will then cause all sorts of, tax implications. So, for example, the most prototypical example of this is you completely trust your kid. Your kid is, or your client does. Your client completely trusts their kid. They're great with money. They could handle $100 million without a problem. But because the child is a beneficiary of the trust, you can't make the child, as the beneficiary, also a trustee without causing all sorts of potential tax consequences or asset protection consequences. So
Or
that
that, yeah.
$10 million line makes a lot of sense, Chris. Christopher.
And then the other thing, Thomas, is if you look at an advisor's top 5% of their clients, this is where they want to make sure they don't inadvertently get replaced when they pass away. So, what we see advisors who are using wealth.com tools, they're going to be very engaged. And so, advisors have an opportunity to use wealth.com more, to be involved there more from a thought leadership standpoint, to embrace the philosophy of money and family and those questions that come out of that. And the other thing is, a lot of advisors have relationships with clients who might be using a corporate trustee that is managing the money currently. And some of those advisors would like to uh, take those assets and really create a holistic financial plan. So that's another avenue of how we get used.
Okay, that makes sense. So on the tax front, how often are, the trustees really handling the taxes? Because I think I work with a few corporate trustees, and most of the times they are the ones who are responsible for at least tracking and keeping the tax team externally at least up to date, making the payments to federal, to state, et cetera. Is that pretty standard?
hmm It is. I would say it's probably 90% of the time. Once you get much bigger clients, sort of north of what Ann talked about, north of the 15, the 25, 30, right? Assuming we have a married couple, that's when you see them wanting to use their own CPA because there's a lot of external stuff going on that it all needs to be coordinated.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense. So, how do people go about really picking a trust company? Obviously, I think there's a little self-serving here. Like, feel free to promote you and what you do. But
That's
like,
right.
like, I think I've seen advisors in communities be like, "Oh, I got my first client. They need a corporate trustee. How do I go pick somebody?" Because fees range a lot, right? Maybe there are some with flat fees versus AUM fees. Like a couple of my clients, they're very high net worth, and they came over as a trustee, and they're not managing the money and they're paying 0.4% on above $10 million just to have the trustee. So they're like, great, how do I get out of this as fast as I can? But I think that's probably a common question advisors have.
So I think the first thing is if you're an independent financial advisor, you really have two choices. You can use the custodian trust companies, right? Schwab, Fidelity, or you can use the independent uh, trust companies like ours. And I think advisors want some portability if they ever change custodians, which you can't if you use, custodian trusts company. I think the larger amounts they want more customized time, right? Because the only thing a trust company has to offer is time. And so if you allocate too many trust accounts per trust officer, then you have a problem with being rushed, saying no too quickly, not really getting creative around the distributions, not really helping advisors create that strong bond with the beneficiaries. So I think it's really the DNA of the trust company, why they exist, how the trust officers handle number of accounts, and those are some of the bigger ones. It's never fees because everyone's going to be pretty close. So it's really is how does the advisor not get embarrassed? And what are you seeing?
Well, so when I was in private practice, we as attorneys also got involved in that conversation of, what kind of trustee might you pick? There's a range out there. There's anyone from not professional trustees, right? Think of like picking your brother-in-law or your cousin because they're far enough removed for tax purposes or whatever that you still have that person. But then that person might move and they might, pass away or become incapacitated. There are all sorts of issues, of course, as well as lack of sophistication potentially with the financial plan, where you might not always go to a non professional individual person. But then you also have these individual trustees who are professionals. They have to get certifications, et cetera, within their states. And it's a fiduciary role, right? And so they take on that responsibility. We saw a lot of them, especially in contentious family contexts. So
Mhm.
think of, the former, except that now you don't want your cousin or you don't want your brother-in-law actually being the trustee because they're family members now who are fighting over the money, potentially at death. And so you might bring in one of these individuals, still not corporate, but an individual to come in and be that sort of neutral third person who can kind of, deal with the distributions, deal with the court, et cetera, and of course the beneficiaries who are not getting along. And then really you start graduating towards more professional corporate trustees. And there, I think that, Christopher, at least for my clients, a lot of the planning, because I worked in the ultra high net worth space, was very tax driven, asset protection driven. And
Mhm.
so there you're picking trustees because of their charters and where they have the ability to operate. At the end of the day, for some of these tax strategies, like you want to do some income tax planning for your trust. You don't want to be paying California income taxes. You can't have a trustee here in California. So then all of a sudden you're picking a company, kind of like Christopher's, where you might be located in a more favorable jurisdiction. And so if the beneficiary ends up paying income taxes because they're still in California or New York or wherever, that's a different question. But at least your trustee has been kind of placed in a state that is attractive and
Mhm.
has an attractive industry for the trust business. And then finally, we had clients who did have those institutional custodian trustees for a variety of different reasons. Maybe they had family offices or, some other reason to have kind of that larger platform. Maybe this is a family that engages in a lot of kind of like M&A, or they have like business interests that make it so that they also need kind of the investment banking side advice, right? And then the trust is getting pulled in because it owns stock in the business. So you kind of see this progression of what clients kind of need. But I think that where we were, if it was very tax driven, very asset protection driven, we actually loved working with a trust company like Christopher's, which we would call, either delegated or directed or administrative trustee. And maybe you can explain to us, Christopher, kind of what the differences there are. That there are trust companies that can be more nimble, truthfully, that may be more creative on the fee structure as well, depending on what kind of trust you're asking them to hold and what kind of assets. But those were some of the advantages that we saw for sure, and we really liked kind of like sitting in that part of the industry as attorneys to work with a trust company like that.
So, and you know what's interesting? So, trust law is driven by state law, right? And there's 7 great states for trust law. It's almost like a W, right? Alaska, Nevada, Wyoming, South Dakota, Tennessee, Delaware, New Hampshire. Those are the magic 7. And they allow the separation between the trustee doing the boring work and the advisor being able to manage the money. They obviously don't have state income tax or state capital gains tax. Trust lasts forever. But 2 states have something really, really unique. They have a legislative governor's mandated trust task force that every single year, well, every year in South Dakota, every 2 years in Nevada, is that they give the state legislators updates to the trust statutes. And there are term limits on this group of the Governor's Trust Task Force. That's why certain states constantly are in a thought leadership position. There's one state that does one thing beyond unbelievably well that may only happen 1 basis point of a % out of most advisors. And that is Wyoming, where you've got a family with $400 million in one asset with mom or dad who built this asset from nothing. They have a family office. They want to put it into a private trust company. The best state to do that in is Wyoming. No joke. That is, I mean, look, South Dakota has private trust company rules. In my humble opinion, Wyoming is better. So for that little teeny tiny piece, that's where you go for that. And these amounts are in the $500 million owning one asset that has been sold, and the creator of the wealth of this one asset is still alive. Once he or she dies, then you need a real trust company doing the real work, but that could be 20 or 30 years. So,
What is that legal feature that makes Wyoming so unique? Do you mind kind of spelling that out? Because I'm actually learning something new today.
so they don't have the same amount of regulatory oversight and cap and surplus requirements that a private trust company has in Nevada or South Dakota. So it's just less regulatory capital driven. And so that's why it's better.
That's very interesting because that
Yeah.
would have been appropriate for a lot of my clients who are out here on the West Coast, who have businesses, concentrated positions in startups that have now, become unicorn companies, and they still haven't divested of all their, initial stock after the liquidity event, potentially. I had a client that actually moved to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and so maybe for them, they should have also brought a slew of people, including their financial advisor with them to form a private trust company, but yeah, no, that's very, very interesting. Christopher, so you said your trust company right now is situated Citus in
In South Dakota.
yes. And
Yeah.
so what else are you exploring in terms of that landscape? I'm wondering.
We're looking at Tennessee, New Hampshire, and Nevada, just depending on, where people are, obviously. The key thing for Tennessee is covering the Southeast, New Hampshire, Northeast, Nevada, um, California, primarily, a little bit of Phoenix. The two best states for trust law right now is Nevada and South Dakota. And the reason is because they have a governor's trust task force that we talked about. People shouldn't get caught up on the what, they should get caught up on the why. Why are these two states year in, year out? It's because it's like what advisors do. They're constantly monitoring and have a systemized process of how they do their updates. Whereas the other states within 6 to 12, 18 months just kind of mimic whatever Nevada and South Dakota do. The one issue that is unique to South Dakota, sorry, you don't mind if I shout it out, do you?
No,
Okay.
no, not at all, and I'm happy
South
to hear it out.
Dakota, South Dakota is the only state in the country that if you go to court to make a change, it's never recorded ever. And it's in the state constitution, not trust statute, state constitution. So if you have families who are public families, either from business, politics, entertainment, or sports, and they like to keep things sort of on the down low, and they make a change to a trust, South Dakota is the only state that never records it ever, and it's at the constitution level, not just at the statute level. Every
So
other state's 2 years and you got to reapply.
let me play this out for our audience. I think recently, if you've been reading, the New York Times, other news media, that very recently the Murdoch family all had to show up in court in Nevada, and the New York Times was able to get their hands on court records and in the public interest, sort of be able to publish these pieces, really detailing in great detail all the family drama for this one family. So what you're saying is, had they had a South Dakota trust, a South Dakota trustee, maybe they could have avoided a lot of the grief from showing up in the media.
Because nothing's recorded.
That is very
That's
interesting.
that it is nothing's recorded. It's
Uh,
approved by the court, and that's it.
That's really
Anyways,
interesting.
I don't know how often that happens, but all things being equal, it's not a bad thing. But
Worth
anyway,
knowing for sure.
yeah.
Okay. Um, so what I'm thinking about is so the average advisor, right? They're thinking about, clients are going through estate planning. We need to get trustees set up. I think part of the conversation for advisors is helping educate their clients on why to hire or why to pick somebody in your family. And I think, and you hit on some really interesting points of like, okay, great. So you pick your brother in law or you pick your friend or something like, I've actually seen a lot of wealthy people start to pick friends, which is, I think, a little bit interesting, right? You're like, okay, I'm going to pick my friend. They're going to pick me. Then, then the second is the contingent's going to be somebody else I know. And we're kind of all going to do this together. And I find a lot of people pick that. One is because it's somebody they know, and two, they're like, okay, great. Like if they need to approve distributions or things, we feel comfortable about that. I think one hesitation for people about hiring trustees is like, what if they don't? Like, I don't want to feel like I have to ask for permission or do things from somebody else that I don't know. How do you help people kind of overcome that concern?
So a typical trustee wants a beneficiary to do a budget. I don't want to do a budget. I don't even know beneficiaries wants to do a budget. My wife gives me a plan of what we can spend for the next 5 years. I can do a plan. So the way that we handle it is we look at the trust document. The advisor gets involved in the financial plan, and then we merge those two things together so the beneficiary knows, oh, this is my plan for this year, but it has a long-term viewpoint of how it's going to deal with the ups and downs of investments and my financial needs. But it's a plan. I think that works much, much better. When individuals are involved, they kind of, and you've, I'm sure, seen this, they just agree to everything. And I give this example. If you have a friend who is a really successful oil and gas guy, his definition of prudent, which is investment and distribution decisions, is going to be very different than if the best friend is a art teacher. Both great candidates potentially, but what's their definition of prudent? How consistent are they for the future generations? And will they be impartial? Will they be balanced? Will they document it all? Right? I mean, and that's what you've seen, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for us, in private practice, you have you need to go to your trustee quite often, right? On behalf of the beneficiaries or even the client who set up the trust and is still alive. And you pick your trustees for a variety of different reasons, but that sort of third party, independent, individual trustee who's really a friend, who's really a business associate, somebody you have to, you want to take out to dinner and you're going to go to their kids, baptism, etc. Like, truly, how impartial are they in the long run? That's a real question, right? And so, if the reason why you set up the trust is because you fear for the beneficiary's ability to not squander the wealth that you built for them, then all of a sudden, that person who's more sort of like rubber stamping the decisions that come before them doesn't even need to be represented by counsel. They're just like, sure, like I trust that you came to me for the right reason. It becomes hard for that person to say no, potentially, or let's plan into this, right? It's not a no, but it's a, what would the implications be of this, and why did we not plan in the way that you're asking us to spend those funds? And so I do think, part of the reason why we as attorneys did really like to have these sort of directed, delegated administrative trustees is because there is still a partner who works with that family, right? Who becomes enmeshed in the fabric of that family and really learns to work well with all of the other trusted advisors within that circle. And let's be honest, oftentimes there is a family member who is, the patriarch or kind of the leader within the beneficiary group, if that makes sense. And you learn to work with that person too, so that actually there's a person to mediate those conversations with the beneficiary who's actually making the request, right? And so there's a whole trusted circle of people involved potentially with that trust. And you, as a financial advisor, need to also work well with that trustee And if it's somebody who is an individual who's there and doesn't really understand the complexity of working with a lot of beneficiaries for that trust, it can be a very frustrating experience for you too. So just loosey-goosey distributions is not always a good thing.
No, and we've seen CPAs talk about this all the time. So, um, I think the other thing is, and then you use the word directed and delegated, just for everyone to know, a delegated trust means we delegate to the investment advisor to manage the money. So if anything goes wrong, we share being on the hook. So it's generally about 20 to 30% more expensive than a directed trust, where the trust document directs us to use Thomas, for example, right? So then we have no duty of oversight on the investments because the grantor told us to use Thomas, and we have a hold harmless language inside the trust document. So that's the difference between directed and delegated. And are you seeing, because we see this, once you get past that 6, 7 million, we see working with a lot of co-trustees, and we do that all the time. Are you seeing that as well?
Yes, absolutely. So the wonderful thing about trusts is that they can be drafted in a million different ways. And they can be drafted in a way that works best for that family's asset composition, the dynamics among beneficiaries, but also, what you want your trustees dynamic to be. And so the wonderful thing is, you can slice and dice kind of the trustee role into all sorts of ways, right? You think of it traditionally as one trustee handling everything, the four things that Christopher has just talked about, but you can actually further subdivide that, right? Trusts are agreements. And so you can say, for example, that you want always a professional trustee, a corporate trustee to help with, holding the assets. And maybe that's partly because you want the state and the income tax implications, right? So
Mhm.
you don't want somebody to be a full trustee who right now lives in South Dakota, but then moves and picks up, their family and moves to New York. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, did they inadvertently move without giving us a chance to like hand off that trust to somebody who stays in South Dakota?
Right.
Right. So that's one reason to potentially have a co-trustee. But honestly, it's also just to get the whole family behind this idea that like this trust is yours. It's the family's, legacy. But you also need to learn how to work with advisors around you who are going to be good stewards with you of this money so that it's not just gone, in a generation. So I think of it as, developing this like muscle, the reflexive, the reflexive muscle so that this family, every single one of the second, third generation are used to working with professionals in this space.
So a trust document is almost like a Legos. You can pull in and out different parts of the Lego, and it can be adapted.
Exactly, and I will
Yeah.
tell you one of the sort of interesting examples that I have is also prenups. We've talked about prenups on this show and
Right.
how some clients want to be the bad guy, right? To have somebody they can point to and be like, "Well, you need a prenup, not because I don't love you," as the beneficiary. That's a very awkward thing to say to your future spouse, but because the trust requires it. Because my father, my mother when they put together this trust, want all of us to get used to thinking about, property and, as the family's thing. And so I think of the trustee almost in the same way. You get to have that sort of neutral third party. Things have been put into the trust, the Lego instructions, right? You've built the trust as a client a certain way so that you can be the bad guy if anything happens and your beneficiaries are undergoing whatever life changes that they are that may not be to your liking.
Fair point.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting point because I think a lot of advisors, maybe even I did early on, assume that like, okay, unless you work with a certain wealth range of a client, then you won't ever need a corporate trustee. But like, I have clients who have it who are in the wealth range, but I also have other people who were considering it because one, they have two kids. One of the kids might have, some some issue, mental, etc. And you're like, I was gonna, do I really want to have my other child oversee this trust? And then now they have a really weird dynamic with their sibling, and then like siblings asking, and then like the other siblings giving approval, and now they've created this like, almost father like, they don't want to have to like, fight with their sibling about this. I've had other people who are like they're single, right? Like I have a client who's 200 plus million net worth. He's single. He has no kids. He isn't married, and so it's like, okay, you want to make sure you use this well, but then do you like have it be for the benefit of your brother, and then your brother, is also the trustee? Like that's also kind of interesting. And what if you pass away before your mom, and so now like your mom can't handle this, so you do need somebody to help think through it. And there's other people who are just like, my wealth is getting so large that the last thing I want to do is have any one of my kids be able to be the trustee of this, 10 plus $1 million trust. And that's if I pass away today, let alone if that's 20, 30 years from now. So I don't think it's always a net worth thing. It's also just like, do you have
Yeah.
somebody in your family? Is there just nobody is capable of handling this? I mean, we all hear the stories of people running out of money really fast. And so it's like, what parameters can you put in to make this money last the longest?
And that goes back to the plan, right? So if you stay away from a budget, but you focus on the plan, so the duration of the plan matches the duration of the underlying marketable securities or trust assets, then you've got that really
Yep.
long-term benefit cooking. So that's the key.
Great point.
And,
Um,
our podcast is called The Practical Planner. So I think I just want to leave our audience with like a nugget of,
Yeah.
something to take away from this. You can plan into the trust investments and distributions the same way that you plan into whatever it is that your clients as individuals want to achieve with their money in their lives. And so that actually is well within your wheelhouse. You have a role that you can continue to play. Of course, you might want to involve a trustee in that. But together, I think that idea of planning into the trust, lifetime of how it manages its money, how, it distributes the money is actually something that you can do.
well, there.
And then from a again, and sticking on the planning on the practical planner, advisors should look at their top 5 clients and make sure who is named as the successor trustee. If it's a friend or family member, get them as a client so they don't get removed when their client passes away. If it's a competing corporation, they probably want to get that changed to someone like us who won't remove them when their client passes away. That's sort of top 5, top 10 clients. And then they should tell every single center of influence that they can manage money when a corporate trustee is required. Because advisors want everyone to know that they have that potential. So those are 2 big takeaways. And don't get hung up on one of the 7 states. That's a commodity, right? Focus on the why. Why this trust company? Why do they exist? How do they think? That they don't manage money, that they don't custody, and that they're in a top state, that's a commodity. That's no more a value add. That's a given.
Love it. Love it. Okay. Perfect way to end. So, Chris, I know we've been waiting to do this for a long time. Really appreciate you coming on and kind of sharing this info with
Absolutely.
everybody.
Thanks,
It's a topic
Thomas.
that we need to do, and good to see you as always. Everybody, if you like this episode, please rate this 5 stars, subscribe, and tune back in for another episode here in a couple weeks.
And thank you so much again, too.
Of course. Thank you.